Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this Beam Exchange webinar, our roughly monthly Grab the Mic event. Just waiting while people join the room. I'll introduce myself. I'm Mike Albu. I'm the director of the Beam Exchange, and it's my pleasure and my privilege to host this event today for some colleagues from ILO and Mercy Corps, who are going to talk about formalization and the MSD approach, business growth, resilience, and improved working conditions. So we're just waiting for a few more people to join the room before I hand over, but I'll run you quickly through the speakers that we have lined up today. That's Judith van Doorn, who's an enterprise formalization specialist at the ILO. She's worked for more than 15 years in the area of sustainable enterprise development, social finance, and formalization. Then we're going to have Helen Bradbury, who's the team leader for Mercy Corps' Alliances program in Georgia and the South Caucasus. She's an advisor on market systems development and women's economic empowerment. And then we'll have Roel Hakemulder. Roel is an international consultant who freelanced these days, and his sort of area is inclusive private sector development. And over the last 12 years, he's been very much involved in market systems development programming. And finally, we'll have a few words towards the end from Merten, Sievers, who's the global coordinator for value chain and entrepreneurship in ILO's SME unit. Anyway, great that you've joined us. What's going to happen is I'm going to hand over in a minute to Judith to take away the webinar. And these four speakers have promised me they're going to speak for about half an hour, at the end of which we will have questions and answers. So if you have questions for the speakers, take a look at the bottom of the screen or somewhere else, but somewhere you should see a Q&A button, a Q&A icon. And that's where you need to put your questions, and I'll be moderating that, and I'll try and pick out as many of the questions as we have time to deal with. If you've got any other problems, technical issues, use the chat box to talk to my colleague Isabel, who's the host today. But otherwise, enjoy this webinar, and you'll hear from me a bit later. For now, Judith, would you like to take us away?
Yes. Start sharing my screen. So let me introduce by explaining why we did the study and what did we look at. So we did this study to identify the degree of formality at different nodes in the value chain. And we wanted to see if there are gradual shifts to formality in enterprises, but also in the wider market system. And for that reason, we looked at a certain framework that we developed specifically for this study. So in this framework, we identified enterprise formalization elements. And we looked, first of all, at the nature of the economic unit, whether it's registered or not. And we looked at internal business practices, such as whether the enterprise is compliant with taxes, social and labor laws, and whether also it is having a professional bookkeeping and issuing employment contracts. But we look at a broader approach. We looked also at transactions in the core value chain. So for example, whether there are written contracts between suppliers and buyers, and whether there are quality certification going on. And we looked at the market systems and the supporting functions, for example, whether enterprises have access to formal finance and social security, and whether they have access to quality certification services. And lastly, we looked at the rules of the game, for example, whether there's an effective regulatory framework in place, and we looked at what are other formal and informal rules of the game and behaviors. So when we had identified this framework, we also came up with a hypothesis. So what did we want to study? Well, we wanted to see whether formalization of economic units can result in more income and better working conditions for entrepreneurs and for workers. And here I want to highlight 2 points. Firstly, formalization is not a goal in itself. So this is a question that I get a lot. People often think that when we talk about enterprise formalization, that's what we want to achieve. But as you can see here, we really see it as a means to an end to achieve ultimately other objectives like more income or better working conditions. The second point I want to make is that also formalization does not automatically translate into these objectives or these achievements to improve people's lives. So several steps will need to happen in between. For example, if an enterprise formalizes, maybe it gets access to a formal bank loan and it can increase its productivity. Or maybe it can put in place quality standards, improve occupational safety and health, and thereby have better working conditions. So several steps will need to happen between formalization of the enterprise and the ultimate goals for the people that we are trying to help. The second part of the hypothesis is that we were assuming that some economic units will formalize if there are strong incentives to do so, and some incentives depend on the market system. And we also assumed that market systems development can facilitate changes in the market system that strengthen such incentives. So maybe to recap, if we read this from the bottom up, we can see that we wanted to test whether market systems development can facilitate changes in the market system that strengthen incentives, based on which in turn economic units will formalize, based on which in turn with different steps in between, people will improve their income and their working conditions. So when we knew what we wanted to study and how we wanted to study it, we needed to find a program where we could find some results and information where we could test our hypothesis. But this was quite difficult because many programs don't have explicit formalization objectives. And also we would want to have some assurance that we could validate our hypothesis so that there would be some formalization results and some positive impact for the people. And also we needed baseline data because we needed to compare the before and after situation. And all of this was quite a challenge. So actually, before we did the study with ALCP, we did another study in West Africa. And we actually found at the end of the study that we could not test our hypothesis. So we continued asking around, and ultimately we were pointed in the direction of ALCP. We got encouraging feedback, and then we decided to go for it. And you will hear more about the results from the study when Roel starts talking. But I want to wrap up by sharing with you what I have learned. Well, first of all, I'm not a market systems development person, so I learned a lot about market systems development, new terminology like facilitation, co-investments, and so on. Don't say trickle down, etc., all of that. And I learned something about the hypothesis, but I'll not talk about that because Roel will do that. But I also learned about incentives and how they can be reinforced. So for example, support services and the regulatory framework can make incentives more strong. And lastly, I learned that market systems development can achieve systemic change, but it requires a constant effort to identify new bottlenecks and facilitate new desired changes. And with that, I'll hand back over to Mike.
Well, thank you for handing back over to me, Judith, but I think we're going to go straight over to Helen.
Okay, here we are. So thank you very much, Judith and everyone, and lovely to be here and to share some thoughts and our ruminations on the work that we did together. It's good for me to stress that it was a very positive experience, and we learned a lot from it, and it's nice to be able to share it today. So the Alliances program, so just to give you some context of the actual program that was studied in this ILO, piece of ILO research. The Alliances program has been based in Georgia in various forms since 2008. And it started in 3 municipalities in an extremely thin market, and again in another region in 2011 in a very thin market. It's grown over the years, as you can see, to now encompassing 3 countries, well, cross-border work from Georgia with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and has obviously achieved impact and scale and systemic change. And I just think it's very positive to know that a program that starts in a thin market can achieve this kind of change. Georgia is, I think, interesting and useful for many people as a study, because there is extreme poverty here, and there, you know, both urban and rural. Obviously, working in the livestock value chains, we concentrate more on rural poor, and you have lack of services, you know, poor sanitation, lack of running water. But you also have a depiction of Georgia in sort of international statistics as more of a middle-income country now. And also the big thing that's happened as part of this was the signing of the EU Association Agreement in 2014, which means that basically all the regulations and legislation of Georgia have to become approximated with that of the EU. Obviously, this has had pretty far-reaching implications on food safety and hygiene and food production enterprises and so on. Dairy is absolutely vital to life in Georgia. Georgia ranges from alpine right down through to semi-desert and everything else in between. But the thing that all of these have in common is that small-scale rural livestock producers they have cows and they will be producing milk and dairy products. When women, of course, are central to this, they are there, you know, taking care of many aspects of the husbandry of the animals, as well as actually producing the dairy products. When we first entered this livestock market system, and dairy was the first sector we seriously entered, it was extremely informal across the board. The main way was for people to produce dairy products at home and sell them to intermediaries, or to go to market and sell them themselves. The problem with this system was it was quite insecure. You weren't guaranteed a sale. When milk was in a glut in early summer, then prices would drop massively, and so on and so forth. There were very few stable entities involved in the system. A very quick look at the donut, which is the representation of our interventions in the livestock system in Georgia. Dairy is there in the core market system, and that involves working with private sector entities directly, facilitating those businesses with various things which I'll discuss in the next slides. At the top, you have the supporting functions, the inputs into the livestock system, which again, Roel is going to discuss in more detail, and again would involve our working with and facilitating private sector entities mainly. At the bottom, in the rules section, you have our work on things that were important, again, underpinning the livestock system. And these are showing some key constraints that we've tackled. Really important here is the National Food Agency, which involved work with obviously the public sector here. And this was about enforcement and regulation of food safety and hygiene compliance and so on. So that they were really important intervention point, which comes up again and again, obviously in the research and the report. So just to give a real idea of what we were doing. So when we first entered, like I said, very informal. So we would scour the landscape looking for agents of scale that would benefit the target group. The target group in this case, as I've said, being small scale livestock producers producing milk and dairy products. So we used to find entities occasionally like this one. As you can see, highly informal. They wouldn't be registered with anyone or anything. They wouldn't be audited. They wouldn't be have any form of contracts with their employees. And they found it incredibly difficult to get any form of financing. They also had a massive problem in accessing knowledge and know-how. So they wanted to develop and they wanted to improve, let's say, technical equipment and the state of the hygiene in their factory, but they simply wouldn't know who to ask. On the donut in the input section, as you saw, it said business development services as one of the inputs needed into the system. That was something the program worked on, because there were no rurally appropriate business development services available at all when we first came into the program area. It was something we had to develop. Also, with the regulations changing and news and so on, these entities were extremely scared of what was coming. They heard that regulations were coming, that there was something happening and that entities could possibly be shut down, and they needed to know what to do. So this is a picture of a factory, you know, a before and after shot. And again, this was another entity. This time, this was an urban-based dairy, highly conscientious, great market, sourcing milk every day from 100 or more farmer suppliers, and yet unable to really develop. So we co-invested with them, technical advice, engineers, architects, and then they gave often cash or in-kind co-investment to make it happen. And that's the same factory after our intervention. So I'm going to pass over to Roel now, who will describe the actual research itself in more detail.
Judith has explained the purpose of the study. This is the approach we followed, which sort of followed the design of the hypothesis, which Judith explained. We developed indicators for market systems change, which were the usual ones that are used in most MSD programs, for formalization and for improved working conditions. ALCP has done a lot of research, both quantitative as well as qualitative, so we made extensive use of that. We did a lot of in-depth interviews with staff, and then 64 interviews with players in the value chain, which are basically the farmers and the dairy enterprises that buy their milk, and then with service providers like vet pharmacies, BDS providers, input providers, and then with a few of the government institutions that are involved in this sector. So what have we seen in terms of market systems change as a result, or as a result of the project, but also in terms of bigger changes that were going on in the environment? So in the rules part of the market system, we have seen that regulation has developed rapidly over the past 10, but especially the last 5 years. In terms of requirements to register for the dairy enterprises, labor legislation, food safety and hygiene standards that were first developed by the government, and then the government developed the HACCP standards of the EU. Here, the involvement of the ALCP was limited, but ALCP did contribute to development of the capacity of the National Food Agency, which was enabled to enforce the legislation, especially in food safety and hygiene standards. Another big change in the market system was in the market for cheese, which is the main product that comes out of the dairy enterprises. In terms of growth in local demand for cheese that complies with safety and health standards, and then formalization of the cheese retail, meaning that instead of cheese being sold informally in markets, there's more and more retail of cheese in supermarkets, supermarket chains, and formal shops. Then the big contribution of ALCP really comes in terms of developing support services to enable enterprises to comply with all these new rules and regulations and to respond to the change in market demand. For the dairy enterprises, so where the cheese is produced, their ALCP developed their capacity, their ability to respond to these changes by cost sharing, as Helen already mentioned, but this was followed by the government funding some of these dairy enterprises to make the changes, and other donor support, as well as in some cases banks being involved. Then consultancy, all types of consultancy was not available in rural areas, and ALCP facilitated the entry of these firms in the rural market, enabling enterprises to become compliant. And training services were developed, and quality assurances services were developed, both internally in the market, in the value chain, as well as support services. For farmers, also here, the embedded training was developed. So dairy enterprises training the farmers to produce the quality milk that was required. Quality assurance also embedded in the value chain. Breed improvement, improved feed, vet pharmacies and vet services, information through a wide range of media on what was happening in the dairy sector and what needed to be done. And then the project facilitated the government stepping in to support the transhumance, which is the annual migration of the cattle from the lowlands to the mountains and back again, which had a lot of problems, including in terms of sickness. And here the government stepped in to improve this. Within the value chain, where ALCP also has made a big contribution, farmers moved from producing non-compliant cheese to selling high-quality milk to compliant dairy enterprises. So this is now about 70% of the farmers doing this in the project areas, instead of making their own milk, their own cheese, and trying to sell it themselves in informal markets, covering 24,000 households. And about 50% of all dairy enterprises now comply with HACCP standards, so the EU HACCP standards, or are working to do so. 39 of those have been supported by ALCP. So we asked ourselves, okay, this are important changes, some which were not really the result of ALCP work, but many which were. Is this change systemic? So basically, is it sustainable, and is it reaching scale? In sustainability, we found that farmers as well as dairy enterprises have increased their market access as a result of the interventions. They have increased profitability. They are further investing in either the farms or the enterprises. The dairy enterprises have diversified their products or are still doing so. And the improved practices in terms of milk production and cheese production have been maintained. All people we interviewed had future plans for their farm or their enterprise, and so these are very strong signs of sustainability. When we look at the services that the project facilitated, these are based on user fees, so they're not anymore in any ways subsidized. They're profitable, And the access is growing, demand is also growing. These are also good signs of sustainability. When we look at scale, the dairy enterprises are investing in expansion. They are involving more farmers, depending on the enterprise, between 6 to 50 times more farmers than before the interventions. Farmers and enterprises are copying independently from ALCP as well. Some 23 dairy enterprises have done that. When we look at services, these are now being accessed by a majority of farmers and enterprises. Now, so these are the changes in the market system, and it looks like they are systemic. But what incentives have been brought about by these changes to formalize the enterprises or to formalize employment? Well, in the first place, survival, because if you don't comply with new regulations or evolving regulations, you simply run a big risk to be closed down. And so formalization is necessary to survive in this market system. Secondly, support is often conditional on formalization. For instance, ALCP does not do cost sharing with dairy enterprises that are not registered and are not registered at the tax authorities. But also other support is often conditional, not only from ALCP, but from other donors and government institutions, is conditional on formalization. A second or third very important incentive is, of course, market access, given the changes in market demand for and the growing demand for compliant products. It was necessary for these enterprises to improve their practices and to meet the new standards. Otherwise, they would not have been able to make use of this growing demand. Sales and income have clearly increased, so that was a strong incentive to formalize. Growth, the enterprises have grown, the farmers have also grown in terms of more production, more cows. And then for the farmers, they save a lot of time and money on the production of cheese at home, because that is a tough job for women in particular, on which they spend usually or on average 3 hours per day. So the incentives have improved. Then what happened to formalization? So the next level in our hypothesis or theory of change. Well, the farmers have adopted standard procedures and practices that enable them to produce milk that can be bought by or will be bought by the dairy enterprises. And there are no laws, there's no legislation that requires farmers to register as a business or to even register their farm, but they do have to register and identify their cattle, and they do have to register their sheds, and they're doing that now. At the dairy enterprises, we found that there's a high compliance with business registration and tax regulations. HACCP has become the standard in the sector, and if enterprises don't comply with these standards, then they are working towards complying with them and towards being certified. And the enterprises have written contracts with their employees, which was also a new phenomenon in the enterprises. And when we look at the value chain, then now there are contracts between retailers and the dairy enterprises, which before was not the case, and verbal or written agreements between dairy enterprises and farmers. Even the verbal agreements were reportedly complied with by the dairy enterprises as well as the farmers. So the final level in our hypothesis was that all this would improve job quality or the decency of work. So when we looked which includes the actual existence of jobs. So when we look at farmers, jobs have been saved. I mean, with all this, this was it's not our assumption, but many of the respondents confirmed that if these changes had not happened, people would have lost their livelihoods. The incomes have tripled. ALCP uses an attribution ratio of 40% for this, so that's very strong. Farmers reported much greater sense of stability and income security because they have this regular takeoff of the milk by the dairy enterprises in particular. Hours and heavy work for women farmers, as I mentioned, 3 hours a day on average. Access to training and education, which is another indicator of good quality of work, and increased gender equality, which is mostly the result of course, women being the key players at the farm level. Made outreach to women rather obvious. It had not much had to be done for that, but the project ensured or facilitated that women who produced would get the income from the milk in their own pockets, and this rather than the man going to sell the milk and taking the income. So this increased their say in income household expenditure decisions. For the dairy enterprises, some 260 full-time equivalent jobs were created. The incomes of these jobs are well above the poverty line, which I should, by the way, also say for the farmers. The increases have brought thousands of farmers' incomes above the poverty line. So in the enterprises well above the poverty line, our indicator was actually the minimum wage is low in Georgia, and it's not even reflected in law, so we dropped that one. Security and stability of income, and the pictures that Helen were. Women and men are paid equally for the same jobs, and actually many of the managers or other highly qualified people who are now working in these enterprises were women. The only weak point that we found was that many of the production workers have very long working weeks, especially in times of high production of milk. So what conclusions can we draw from that? Well, farmers and enterprises and distributors have formalized in order to meet the requirements of the evolving regulatory framework, to gain and expand access to the formal market for their products. And the key role of ALCP here has been to facilitate them, enable them to do so. Without ALCP, these changes would very likely not have happened. And many of our interviewees confirmed that they would not have been able to meet the new requirements, and farmers as well as the enterprises would have lost either their whole income or a main source of income. So we conclude that the hypothesis that MSD can contribute to formalization and improved working conditions was confirmed by this study. Thanks.
Great, Roel, thank you very much. And it was great, almost all of that we heard with crystal clarity, even though you're broadcasting from Central Africa. Anyway, that's fantastic. We are running a little bit late. Please put any questions you've got in the chat box, because the panelists can already answer them. And in fact, Judith's been very good at answering some of the questions already. But meanwhile, I'm going to hand over quickly to Merten and then Helen to wrap up.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, maybe very quickly, I think what is interesting about this study and interesting for market systems development is that when we've looked in the past at formalization in the ILO, it's often been either, I would say, either sort of the activist type, kind of looking at the micro enterprise, at the informal sector, trying to kind of figure out how can we support that micro enterprise kind of with sometimes a supply driven approach, kind of to climb up that ladder to formalize. Or on the other hand, with a remote reformer type of intervention, kind of we fix the overall rules in the business environment, and that will then automatically lead to formalization, a bit maybe part of the theory behind doing business of the World Bank as well, kind of, you fix the business environment and it will happen automatically. Well, it doesn't. So the interesting part of this study is really that we're looking at the meso level, at the conjunction of a different set of things happening, an improvement or a tightening of the regulatory framework, but also increased market demand. So there's a pull factor, but also a sort of negative incentive to stick around that basically tells those producers of cheese that if they don't comply, they might not have access to that market. So I think there's a range of things that sort of confirms that looking at a system, looking at a market system, actually provides entry points to understand better how to reach formalization. So I think that's quite unique about the study, and quite an interesting kind of conjunction of market systems development and formalization. That's it from my side. So I think that's the interesting part here for me.
Yeah, very, very nicely put. Helen, last word for you from the panelists before we go to the audience.
Yeah, I've got one last slide which has some things on it. Why is that not working? Come on. There we are. Just very quickly, this was beneficial. I mean, obviously, we haven't got a program that says it was a formalization program. It was a program to, at scale, impact poverty, generate income, and jobs in later phases of the program. So it's always, from our point of view, it's always looking at who the target group are that we want to affect, and then really working backwards from the target group and finding agents of scale that will do what we want it to do, and that involves working on these constraints in the system. But formalization, obviously, in this context, was a thing that was necessary to avoid, as Roel and Merten have both said, loss, being excluded from the market. So, but for us, what this also did, it was really, really interesting to do it, because it did bring some things into sharper focus. And for us as a program, we'd already noticed that there were things going on with jobs. And this study helped us understand more what those things were, but also, value the benefit of jobs more clearly, look at them more closely, pay more attention to the elements of decent working conditions. And as we monitor those things more and more deeply, really, and have excellent qualitative information as well, you can see how much benefit jobs bring to a community, especially in terms of net attributable income change. If you're a program, it's in your interest to generate jobs because the Nike that comes through it from it is excellent. It has provided an enhanced lens for me when it comes to looking at strategy and interventions, and for all of us when we come to another phase of the program or designing a new intervention, to consider this now, to look at formalization actually as a thing in itself, and to consider how that affects things going forward. It's useful. And just as an interesting point, because we're still, being very much affected by the pandemic, these formalized enterprises showed a really very considerable degree of resilience during the pandemic. They were able to diversify, for example, because they had technical knowledge, because they had decent equipment, because they had markets that were formal markets, so they weren't shut down by the government. So all the informal agricultural markets were shut down. The shops, the formal supermarkets stayed open. So they kept their markets, but entities, for example, that were producing high value specialist cheese for the hotel, restaurant and catering sector, HoReCa sector, were able, for example, to change to producing Imeruli cheese, which is the main cheese that is eaten, the common cheese. Also, jobs weren't so much lost as time, hours were reduced, but staff were kept on. And also those with storage facilities, for example, could do things like freeze certain products to tide them over till the market picked up again, particularly when the first lockdown happened. This picture here is actually one of the entities who Roel visited. They distributed free dairy products to people in need, poorer people within the community during the pandemic. So I thought that was sort of nice to share. And a good piece of news too, that picture on the minibus behind them is actually of the Georgian Milk Mark, which has been the next step of formalization. And now there's a Georgian Milk Federation and a whole auditing system to promote equitable, community-produced quality milk. That hasn't got any additives in it. So it's a nice story.
Very nice story, Helen. Thank you. And it's great to hear it again, or updated version of the story. Fantastic. Really nice presentations, guys. So Judith has been an absolute star, and she's been beavering away answering questions in the Q&A box, which means I don't want to ask her to repeat everything that she's typed, because if you're interested in the kind of questions that she was answering, you can read them now, or we can get them to you later in the mail out that we do after the webinar. But basically, there were a couple of questions related to the costs and the disincentives to formalization, which came from Martin Clemenson. And Judith, do you want to just sum up in very briefly what the essence of your reply to him was?
Yes, I was saying that, well, there's a whole lot of things that actually should come together. And I actually lumped it together with the question about how to sustainably formalize enterprises. So first of all, make it cheaper to formalize. Taxes is a big deal for enterprises. So waiving tax or waiving it in the beginning when you are formalizing can help. Reducing red tape, because it takes a lot of time to go through all the procedures, and there's a lot that is done in that area, one-stop shops, online platforms, etc. But what's really important is to identify incentives that are effective. And sometimes programs say, yeah, we provide them training. Well, it will not do the trick. You really need a good incentive. Like this case shows how new market opportunities in the formal economy help. It then makes a business case for them to formalize. Social security, which we see outside market systems development, is a very strong one. We've seen it in Brazil, but then the government has kind of over-subsidized. So then, it has not been anymore a successful case study, but I think the model is very valid. So incentives are very important. And I was underlining the importance of what I call productivity, but even the ALCP case shows, right? Lifting these enterprises to a higher level so that they can actually seize these new opportunities and actually they can bear the cost of formalization. That's it. Thank
you. That's great. So look, Helen, there was a couple of questions about sort of practical stuff, like Bojan asked about for a bit more details and information about the co-investment mentioned in your presentation. What form did that take? What kind of terms and conditions were offered to the firms that you worked with as partners?
Yeah, I mean, the good news on this as well is we do have an investment manual available on our website. So point you to that as well, because it's got all the details of everything in it. But essentially, in the past, we've had lots of discussions with lots of people about whether these are actually just grants. You could say so, actually, in a way. However, they're tailored to each enterprise and dependent on their structure and their needs. So they basically work around the idea that the co-investment of the private sector entity will be negotiated between us, but based on like flexible things that they can provide, like they will do usually the fixed assets. We do the movable assets because just in case we do get into trouble, then we can take them away. We haven't had to do it very often, but it's part of the whole risk reduction of the process. So basically they can include, yeah, the labor, the building cost and so on, and we will do the other. And it's, you know, technical support in terms of procurement, the right equipment, like we said, the BDS services. In the beginning, we had to bring those in because they just weren't available rurally, but we worked and worked and worked so that those services became rurally appropriate. Food safety and hygiene consultant, yeah, architect for designing the actual, facilities where needed in it, so that they were compliant. Sometimes helping with land title registration. So we did not get involved specifically with working on, let's say, addressing the government about the mechanisms of how a business registers itself. We didn't go anywhere near that, but we were, I suppose, working on elements of formalization where we specifically worked with the NFA, the National Food Agency, with things like how they were doing their inspections, or helping them understand even about these factories that were upgrading themselves, because actually what happened in the beginning was that when this set of factories became compliant, they were the first compliant factories and therefore got inspected all the time because there was nobody else to actually match to the standards. So it was that kind of advocacy and intervention in the system in terms of the compliance regulations.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think that's really helpful. Judith, someone, again, you did actually answer us in the box very helpfully, but Nina Paustian asked about different types of the characteristics of the enterprises and how that affected the outcomes. So in terms of their size and so on. And someone else also had a similar question about the size of the enterprise, the turnover, the employment numbers. Were these factors important in determining the outcomes?
Yeah, so how I responded to the question is that I think it matters a lot in terms of the approach. So we know there's many different reasons why what we call economic units are informal. You can have your own account worker or self-employed person, individual person without employees, ranging all the way up to an enterprise that is registered but hasn't declared its workers or is like under declaring its taxes. So there's an element of capacity versus unwillingness to formalize. So that means you need to approach them in a different way. But yeah, I think she's looking for something else. I don't know in terms of outcomes what actually the question is exactly, but my main point is in terms of the approach, you need to deal with them differently.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you. So look, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to broaden it out slightly to more general principles. Merten talked about why he liked this program, this example, this study as something that was slightly different from the normal approach to formalization, either being pushed from the bottom or driven by remote reform. There was a question actually from Gordon Freer. I don't think he's here today, but he sent it in advance about to what extent was the formalization process itself simplified to ease registration, for example, for smaller businesses. Was there Helen, I think you might have mentioned it, whether or not there was a drive to try and change the rules.
Yeah, not specifically in, I think, the traditional sense of formalization, but we worked on it in a different way. So rather than actually going in on that specific, let's say, registration of a business, it was more saying these businesses have no one to turn to ask what they even need to do to become formal. There's nobody helping them. There's no signposts anywhere. They just don't know where to get that information. They wouldn't know what to Google to really get in, because it was so urban centered. It was, well, capital really, not even urban, but just based in Tbilisi. So it was more on concentrating on developing decent business development services and food safety and hygiene consultant services, and actually also an environmental consultancy company, so they didn't get clobbered with fines for, you know, putting their whey and dairy juice into, you know, not disposing of it properly. So it's more about providing places for them to go who they will then help them with formalizing and stuff, but not actually in this case on simplifying that process. No, more about also things like with again, HACCP certification, you know, letting companies understand what it means, what they need to do, but not actually simplifying the process. No.
Okay.
Facilitating the process.
Facilitating, yeah.
Yeah.
Roel, I left you out a little bit during the Q&A. Is there anything you wanted to add in response to the same question? Are you still with us? Or have we lost you?
So, what Judith said about you know, the incentives and the costs of formalization, which is something we asked the respondents about, and those enterprises that had to pay taxes, which was the majority, some of them are exempted from taxes because they are located in the highlands, but most did pay the taxes. Confirmed that, you know, the costs were much the benefits were much higher than the costs, and that they, you know, there were no regrets about having to formalize. So I think that's the point. As long as the incentives are good enough, people will formalize if they are well informed. Okay,
thank you, Roel. Well, Judith, Helen, Merten, Roel, it's been a really fascinating hour and a very approachable presentation, and I'm very keen, I'm sure other people are, to follow up and look at the investment manual, or indeed the study itself when it's published. So we're gonna send all the links for these materials out with the follow-up email, and also a link to the recording of this webinar. So if you've got any colleagues who you think would be interested, please do forward it to them and share the knowledge and the wisdom that you've heard today. One last request from me personally before you leave the webinar is please click on that link that's just appeared in the chat box, which is to our feedback survey, just to let us know what you thought about the webinar today and what if anything we can do to improve our webinars. And if you represent an organization that you think would like to present something similar like this, take the opportunity to share your experiences or studies or work you've done, please get in touch with us, because this is what we call the Grab the Mic webinar, and it's always open to any organization doing work in market systems development to take the space and share their knowledge and their experiences. So I will say thank you again to Helen, to Judith, Merten and Roel for a fantastic set of presentations, and thank you all for attending, and join us next time. Take care.
Thank you.